All right. Well, I want to go ahead and jump into the first question because Elijah is one of the craziest characters to me in the Bible. And he's just so over the top. And so I want to know, what do we know about Elijah as a person before we can kind of set up this story about him and Jezebel and Ahab?
Well, we don't know a whole lot about Elijah because the first time we're introduced to Elijah is in 1 Kings chapter 17. And there's just not a whole lot of historical data on Elijah. He appears and we know who his father was, but we don't have history of his background, his upbringing. We know he was obviously very devout follower of Yahweh. And I think characteristic of most of the prophets, or a lot of the prophets, he was a very colorful character. He was unconventional. He was coarse. He was outspoken. He was brash. He was uncouth. And when you look at a lot of other prophets, John the Baptist and so many, they were not very normative in society.
Hmm. So I didn't realize that chapter 17 was the first time that we're meeting Elijah. I mean, I started reading at chapter 17 because Daniel told me to, but I didn't go I
Right.
didn't go before to realize that we had not been introduced to Elijah. How?
We've got Isaiah
Yeah, yeah.
and
So
yep.
So how did he become one of the most prominent prophets that we know if there's so little about him?
Well, the Jews believed that Elijah was Melchizedek, that he was ushering in basically a new kingdom, that almost a Messiah. So and I'm not no expert on the Jewish faith, but he's a very important character uh, in Jewish tradition and custom because they believe that he was. I mean, obviously, he saw God. He was ushered, up into heaven by God. He was special. He was significant.
So do we know why Elijah was in Samaria? Because that's where this whole story took place.
Well, there were two kingdoms, and the northern kingdom of Samaria was kind of the hub, so to speak, and then there was the southern kingdom of Judah because we're in the ninth century, and so as a prophet of Yahweh, Elijah was called by God to go and speak uh, to the king and tell him, hey, following Baal, worshiping Baal is not cool. So he had to go into Samaria, which was the hub. There was a temple there to Baal. And so he went there to speak this word that he thought was from God, that, hey, if you continue to turn from Yahweh God, you will suffer with a drought and all these consequences because we know the king was a follower of Yahweh until he married Jezebel. And that was a political marriage to try to, I don't know if unite's the best word, but for political reasons, bring these two kingdoms together. But obviously that didn't happen.
Well, and this whole story is centered around the worship of Baal. And Baal is a god that the people were worshiping in Samaria, and Elijah came in and said, "No, I worship the true God, and I'm going to show you that." What do we know about, because this isn't the first time that Baal is mentioned in the Bible. What do we know about the worship of Baal as a god in
Well, there
that
were
time
there were a
culturally?
lot of gods being worshipped and kings that thought themselves to be God, like Nebuchadnezzar, that built an idol of himself. So there were a lot of pagan gods. Baal was one of many, but it was prominent. When Jezebel married Ahab and she became the queen and he was the king, she was raised in a family where they were pagan and they worshiped lots of gods, Baal being prominent, the prominent god who was the god of nature, the god of fertility. And so Jezebel basically when she became queen, got King Ahab to renounce his belief in Yahweh God and began to worship this pagan god of Baal. And so he was one of many gods, but a god that was a deity that was very popular.
So, so we have this whole story that um, Elijah was in a land that they worshiped Baal. He went to the king and was trying to talk about, my God, and introduce, the God that we worship, the Hebrew God.
Right.
And then there's this whole dramatic play of there are 450 prophets of Baal who, and it's really funny story. This is the Alyssa version of the story. So
Right.
Elijah puts together this altar of a calf on wood and stone and challenges the 450 prophets of Baal, pray to your God and set this aflame. And they are praying and wailing and ripping their cloaks and trying to get Baal to send down fire. And Elijah starts mocking them mercilessly.
Yeah.
Of like, oh, your God must be taking a nap. Your God must not be listening. Like maybe he stepped away for a moment. I don't know. Which I just find absolutely hilarious. And then Elijah calls on the Hebrew God, and God immediately comes down with fire. And they say that in the scripture, it says that God licked up the offering with flames to the point that there weren't even stones left. And then all of the people who had watched this happen immediately dropped to their knees and confessed God
Right.
as their Lord.
Right.
But then Elijah takes it a step further and slaughters all 450 prophets of Baal. And so this leads to my next question, which is the really tough one.
Yes.
Why did Elijah have to go to that step of killing the 450 prophets? And why is that okay? Is that what God wanted Elijah to do, is to slaughter 450 people? Because the people who were there and watched it already dropped to their knees and confessed God. I just don't understand why that had to happen.
Well, I'll tell you what I believe is that that Elijah thought he was honoring God and being obedient to God. The scripture doesn't say God told Elijah, take these 450 prophets of Baal and kill them. It's not that clear, but you have to think they're following Mosaic law from Deuteronomy, where it's very legalistic and it's very stringent, and there were many consequences. So if you denounced Yahweh God, if you were blasphemous, it was treason, really, that they were intentionally trying to convert people, turn them away from God, which is punishable by death. There were a lot of things that if you broke the law, it was immediate death. And that was just a consequence of a lot of behaviors, of a lot of sin, because God's law was ultimate, supreme. I mean, of course, it still is, but in a very narrowly defined. I mean, think about the culture, the society. It was not sophisticated, and so there wasn't a lot of grace extended, and it was very absolute. So I believe that Elijah, even though, as you said, those other 400 and so people that were there immediately dropped to their knees and said, Yahweh is God, your God is the God, he still felt like these were leaders, these were prophets of another deity. And the only way to ensure, so to speak, that the folks that were remaining in Israel would continue to worship Yahweh God, or turn to God, as it were, was to execute them and to just kind of ensure that there wouldn't be more conversions to this false idol, to this false god. So I think he thought he was being very um, devout and doing what he needed to do as a matter of business in honor to Yahweh God.
Yeah, I guess I really hadn't considered that cultural legalistic element of this is what we do. If you're
That's right.
worshiping, what we consider to be a false god, then the punishment is death. And so it's almost like Elijah is taking it into his own hands. I just can't, and this is, of course, I don't know the mind of God, obviously, but I just can't imagine that God was pleased with that. I don't know. It's just it's
Right. That's
hard.
that's
It's
the conundrum, especially throughout the Old Testament. The eye for the eye and the tooth for the tooth and the annihilation of Sodom and Gomorrah if there's not a righteous person. And so there's very much in the Old Testament, obviously, a very angry, vengeful, wrathful God that can be portrayed. We know God to be loving. We know God to be kind. We know God to be just. And it's hard to justify, to me, any killing that's righteous or not, with the best of intentions or not. So I can't justify that. But I do believe that in Elijah's quest and zealousness, and again, he was coarse, he was rough, he was he in his eagerness to please God. It's like, hey, I'm trying to do what you've told me to do. I'm trying to ensure that the Israelites turn to you and worship you as their chosen and favored people. And these guys are in the way, so they're gone. Out of here, did my job.
well, and also, kind of going back to cultural context, um, you brought up Jezebel. I did have a question about Jezebel because this is one of the things that I find so interesting about scripture. So we have, Jezebel gets a pretty bad rep, right? Like we have
Sure.
turned Jezebel into the archetype of an evil, wicked woman. And you don't hear it as much in more progressive churches, but definitely
Hmm.
in more traditional evangelical churches, you still hear women called Jezebels.
Right.
So why has she become that archetype? Where did that come from? Because when I read through the scripture and read about Jezebel, I was like, you know what? She was just a woman trying to protect her people and working with what she knew, but we've created her to be this like ultimate villain. Do you
Right.
know more about that?
Well, all we know about Jezebel really is, or all I know, is from scripture. And Jezebel was strong. She was shrewd. As I said, she was brought up in a pagan household as a princess and had a lot of privilege. And then when she was taken to Samaria, it was more conservative. Those that worshiped Yahweh God were more conservative. There were more rules and regulations and restrictions. So she was kind of the party girl going to the conservative kingdom, so to speak. So that was probably one strike against her. But we know she was cunning. We know she was driven. The fact that she converted her husband to a new religion or a different religion, she had some chutzpah and she was convincing. And she obviously had to have some strong backbone and she knew what she wanted and she went for it. And so, in all those are attributes we kind of esteem as, hey, she's strong. She's was probably very intelligent and so those are things that are positive attributes. But the Jezebel that, as you say, when women are called Jezebels, is a very uncomplimentary kind of a term. I think comes from when we know the end of the story. If we know the end of the story with Jezebel, there was a contract on her. I mean, she was going to be killed. Her husband was already King Ahab was already dead. Someone else wanted to take out her son, the heir, so that he could be king, and he had to get her out of the way. So when she was preparing for her ultimate death, because prophecy said she'd be eaten by dogs, basically cursed and eaten by dogs, and she probably believed that, or at least believed she would be killed. Scripture says that she puts on makeup and puts on her finest clothes. She's preparing for her death in a very classy way. One school of thought is she just wanted to die with dignity and honor. The other is perhaps she wanted to seduce her assailant because she was in her bedroom. And so I think that kind of
Or maybe she's a 3 on the Enneagram and just wanted to go out in style.
maybe so, maybe so. But we don't know. We don't know exactly. So the fact that she was maybe dressed seductively and had on makeup and was waiting for this man to come in her bedroom to kill her, she this was a last ditch effort for her to save her life. So I think that kind of reputation of a woman of ill repute, she was strong. She was not going to back down, and kind of that last scene of her life is, I think, what has attributed to the more sensual aspect of that part of her life as prostitution, or she was willing to do these things in order to gain something else.
Well, that's about all we have time for. I love these conversations. So, Karen, thank you so much for for joining us today. And I hope that I'll be able to have you back again, because I love digging into these questions of, well, why does the Bible say this, and what's the history behind that? And I think it's really exciting. So,
Absolutely.
I hope that everybody enjoyed it, and remember to join us again on Wednesday. Daniel will be back on Wednesday at 12:30 for Go Beyond. And this is my favorite day, where I get to challenge the message and challenge Daniel a little bit, push him a little bit outside his comfort zone. My favorite thing. So